In the hush before dawn, when fog clings to fields and the world feels like it remembers something terrible, there is a house that the maps ignore. Locals whisper its name as if a word could summon what is buried there. The Sullivan place. Built of hand-hewn timber and old brick, it stands crooked on its foundations, a silhouette of a promise gone wrong. This is not a story of simple cruelty. It is a slow unraveling of faith, twisted into fear, of charity, turned to captivity, and of 47 small lives reduced to echoes. In a stone room, listen carefully, the house still keeps its secrets. Thomas Sullivan arrived in the valley, with a Bible on his arm and speeches full of salvation. He spoke to parishioners about duty, about sheltering the lost, about moral repair. He wore a preacher's collar and took meals with merchants and magistrates. But the Sullivan household was not just a home. It was a project, a private mission, that grew like ivy and eventually strangled the truth beneath it. The first wagons that came to the yard carried children who had no voices left to speak for them. The town took the preacher at his word until the nights began to smell of iron and wood smoke. Neighbors noticed the pattern slowly, the late-night arrivals in covered carts, the silence that followed, the absence of play at the Sullivan yard. Mothers kept children indoors. Shopkeepers whispered about unpaid bills and children no one could place. When a child dared to press an ear to the cellar door, all anyone would say was that Thomas kept them safe. So the town nodded and went on, because who questions a man of God until the noise becomes impossible to ignore? The first impossible sound was not a scream, but a scratching, tiny nails etching at stone from the other side. On a bitter night in November of 1834, thunder rolled over the valley and lightning revealed the world in stark, blinding flashes. Elijah Ward, a boy seeking refuge from the storm, saw through a crack what no one had fully imagined. Chains bolted into stone, the glint of metal catching the lantern light, and the silhouette of small bodies pressed into the darkness. He ran to tell the sheriff and was met with a kinder dismissal than his terror deserved. By morning, the Sullivans were gone, vanished as if the earth had swallowed their footsteps. The cellar door remained shut, and the world exhaled with a careful, dangerous silence. For decades, the house stood empty, rumor curling outward like smoke. Fields reclaimed the orchard and vines braided through porches. No one set foot inside unless necessity demanded it. Then, in the late 1890s, men with hammers and business sense came to salvage timber for a new mill. They pried open a cellar hatch and descended into a smell of old damp and something worse, a dry iron tang. Their lamps revealed lines of short iron lengths bolted into the mortar, and beneath the uneven floor, bone and broken toys told of lives cut short. The number scratched into a beam stunned them at 47. Among the recovered items were diaries, a brittle stack bound with twine, pages browned and worm-eaten but legible. The handwriting inside was small and hurried. It belonged to Mary Sullivan, the eldest daughter, whose words moved like a rope frayed at both ends. Confessions of obedience warped into complicity, small, desperate kindnesses, and finally, a voice that trembled with the knowledge of what her father had done.
She wrote of lullabies that turned to pleading,
of food passed through cracks, and of a faith that demanded cruelty in the name of salvation. Her script mapped the basement like a map of guilt. Mary's pages described a doctrine of purification. Thomas's sermon on sin broadened into a design for correction. Children were held for their moral failings, he explained, in a language that conflated punishment with protection. The records reveal no legal authority sanctioned this. Instead, it was a private terror masquerading as mercy. As the diaries unfolded, they sketched a chilling, methodical life underground. Names scratched on stone, rationing of bread and water, the hush of constant fear. The reader can almost hear the tiny coughs, the whispering hoof of mice, the faint prayers mumbled into the dirt. When the bones were catalogued, every investigator's stomach turned. The remains told of neglect and worse, healed fractures left uncared for, malnutrition, and signs of restraint at the joints. Yet official records from the period show little prosecution. There were inquiries, statements hushed and misfiled, and witnesses whose memories were smoothed by fear or influence. Why did a community so near to the wound allow the silence to hold? Some historians point to class and power. A preacher with wealth and alliances can call favors and buy patience. Others suggest fear. Confronting the truth would unmake the town's moral story. and so the town chose self-preservation over justice. Stories like this mutate in the telling. Children who survived were dispersed, their names lost in ledgers. One witness, in later life, whispered of a lullaby hummed beneath boards, a tune that lodged in his mind for decades. Survivors who tried to speak were shushed or sent away. Some left the valley with the taste of iron in their mouths and the habit of silence in their throats. That silence became its own binding chain of social amnesia that kept the story from reaching the records it deserved. But every so often an ember would flicker, a neighbor who could not sleep, a priest who could not forget, a child who would not stop crying. Time adds layers and removes faces, but it does not erase evidence. Local newspapers of the era carried clotted paragraphs about missing children, small headlines that the next week's advertisement swallowed. Court dockets show names crossed out and cases deferred. Money changed hands in private rooms. Promises were made that never materialized in public filings. The pattern is familiar to anyone who studies hidden crimes. The law, the powerful and the polite, collude to fold tragedy back into the floorboards where it will not embarrass them. The bones remain, the names are scratched in stone, but the ledger of truth sits in fragments. In the decades that followed, the Sullivan place acquired a reputation. Teenagers dared each other to touch the gate. Ghost hunters came with tinny equipment and more thrill than method. Paranormal researchers in the 1970s recorded strange EMF spikes and shaky footage that local authorities later sealed from public view. One tape, fragmented and static-drenched, captured, according to the researchers, an event that made men leave their professions, a whispering voice and a young, unplaceable sob that seemed to speak a number. 47. The tape stops abruptly mid-breath. Those who saw that footage speak of an intimacy of sorrow that stays with you. People ask, what does it mean when a place is haunted? Is it ghosts or memory? Is it echo or evidence? At the Sullivan site, both answers feel true. The physical traces, chains, carved names, diaries, sit beside a cultural echo. Neighbors who swallowed their guilt. Descendants who never knew or refused to know. And a place that keeps calling for someone to remember correctly. To approach the house is to feel the air change. Breaths come quicker. Light seems thinner. Memory in places is a force. It can bend a mind to sorrow or straighten it to action. Modern investigators pieced together a timeline from disparate scraps. They found shipping logs, names of families who lost children to sudden relocation, and a ledger in the Sullivan papers listing food rations and a chilling tally of numbers. The ledger's numerals corresponded to dates and small annotations, reasons for removal. From the outside world, each entry was a bureaucrat's indifference recorded in ink. When researchers cross-referenced the ledger with cemetery, plots and probate notices, a pattern of institutional blindness emerged. The ledger became, in a sense, the clearest evidence of wrongdoing, not dramatic on its surface, but damning in its quiet arithmetic. Voices in the valley remembered fear as if it were a weather pattern. A woman who worked at the local mill in the 1840s later said she would cross the road rather than pass the Sullivan gate. Children were taught never to ask about the Sullivans. That small cultural education teach children to avert their eyes, preserved a silence, longer than any law. But that silence erodes when someone cracks the shell, when a diary surfaces, when bones prove the rumor, when a researcher insists the record be read. Once opened, memory pours out like water from a clogged basin. It soaks everything, it stains everyone. What of the Sullivans themselves? Public records show a family that dissolved into rumor. Thomas seems to have moved like a shadow in the years after. 1835, absent from registries. Unnamed in tax rolls. A name that appears and disappears like a smudge on glass. Some accounts suggest he fled to rivers where bodies sink without notice. Others claim he assumed another identity and lived on until the end of his days, wrapped in self-justification. Mary's diary ends in ellipses, words of remorse and a plea that someone would one day tell the truth. Her final entry suggests she intended to expose him, but lacked power to proceed. Survivors who reached adulthood spoke rarely and under duress. One former child, discovered in another county, described a ritualized day, the counting of plates, the evening roll call at the cellar threshold, the sound of iron rubbing stone. He remembered the names etched under the chain rings, names sung as a sorrowful list, and how children would recite them to keep their identities alive. Those names, once carved in haste, became anchors to the self. The preservation of a name in such darkness is an act of defiance, and the chains, however cruel, failed in their ultimate purpose. They could not fully erase a person's memory of who they were. After the bones were exhumed, there were attempts at restitution. Funds were raised, a small memorial considered, a legal suit threatened, but the mechanics of rural poverty, of power structures and legal inertia, made restitution partial and symbolic at best. The court that convened felt the pressure of social networks whose fingers reached into decisions. Compensation arrived in meager parcels. A handful of markers were placed without much ceremony. This was not justice measured. It was a slow, awkward admission that change would never quite atone. The valley moved on with a small, uneasy conscience. In the late 20th century, interest in forgotten crimes bloomed into research and cinema. The Sullivan case attracted historians drawn to the edges where official histories fray. They examined tax logs, orphanage records, and letters tucked in family Bibles. What they found complicated the narrative. Systemic absenteeism in child welfare, economic incentives hidden in adoption and guardianship, and a cultural blind spot that equated charity with moral power. These scholars argued that the Sullivans were not monstrous anomalies, but grotesque manifestation of larger systems that allowed and sometimes encouraged private control over vulnerable lives. Those who study darkness say the only remedy for such wounds is attention. Memory properly tended can be a kind of justice. So historians, advocates, and descendants pushed for a more honest public record. They lobbied to include the Sullivan story in county histories, to mark the site and teach the children who attend nearby schools what happened. Some resisted, ashamed families preferring silence, but others agreed the truth, told carefully and respectfully, honors those who suffered. To remember is not to sensationalize. It is to rescue truth from being a rumor. Haunting in this case took on a moral dimension. It demanded that the living examine their choices. The chains in the cellar are emblematic. They are iron and human both, representing both physical restraint and social complicity. A place can be haunted by spirits or by history. The Sullivan house is haunted by both. People who walk past it today sometimes say they feel guilt as if it were their own, as if the town threw a mission for a communal fault. That sensation is not supernatural. It is conscience made visible, a social muscle flexing under the weight of memory. For the storyteller, the Sullivan tragedy offers lessons and warnings. It reminds us that good intentions unchecked by accountability can become monstrous. It shows how systems meant to do good, churches, charities, guardianship, can be perverted when power is concentrated and transparency absent. Most disturbingly, it underscores how communities choose comfort over confrontation. It is easier to look away than to uproot a local legend, even when that legend is a lie. That choice leaves stains that last beyond a single lifetime. When a camera lens lingers on the cellar doorway in modern footage, viewers feel the tension between curiosity and dread. The human mind wants storylines, villains, victims, clear moral arcs. Real tragedies resist neatness. The Sullivan story is chaotic, bureaucratic, and raw. It asks for careful listening rather than quick judgments. It asks audiences to hold discomfort and not reduce suffering to spectacle. As you watch, remember that the facts, ledger entries, names carved in stone, a child's diary, belong to real people and real grief. There are nights when the wind plays through. The broken eaves and the sound suggests a lullaby long forgotten. On those nights, an old woman in town says her grandmother used to tuck a child close and whisper the names that were carved into the stones so that memory would not vanish. That gesture, small, stubborn, is what keeps truth alive. We tell these stories not to thrill the heart with horror, but to honor. To name the lost is to relieve, if only a little, the burden of forgetting. The Sullivan place today is fenced and catalogued, but its lessons leak outward. The conversations it sparks range from the historical, how systems fail, children, to the personal, how families cope with shame. Documentary filmmakers who approach the subject must navigate ethical lines. How to represent pain without exploiting it. How to speak for the silenced without speaking over them. Responsible storytelling means centering survivors, contextualizing evidence, and resisting sensationalism. That practice is part of the repair. As this account closes, consider the small acts that matter. A name read aloud, a ledger preserved, a diary translated and archived, and boy, these are slow artesian wells of memory that water future justice. The Sullivan story is not satisfied with outrage. It calls for vigilance, for legal oversight, for child protection systems that are transparent, and for communities brave enough to interrogate their past. If there is a single imperative, it is this: do not let the small, stray truths be buried by comfort. We are left with images that do not leave us. No, iron rings catching a single shaft of daylight, the curl of a child's toy half buried in dust, a ledger numbered in indifferent ink. Those images are not an end, but a promise that stories, once heard, will demand action. In hearing them, we join a chain that resists forgetting. The Sullivan house may stand out of sight, but it stands within the reach of anyone willing to remember. Let that memory be an obligation, not mere curiosity. If you visit the site now, you will find caution tape and state plaques that speak in clinical language of preservation. You will not find the noise of children, but beneath the official text lies a quieter truth in that history sometimes hides the worst things. Under its furniture, we tell these stories not to chill but to illuminate. If the Sullivan story teaches anything, it is that everyday structures of trust must be watched, because monsters do not always arrive as strangers. Sometimes they are neighbors with steady hands and friendly smiles. So we leave you with the names, not as a list to be consumed, but as a promise to the living and the dead, that we will not let them be reduced to numbers. The carved marks on the stone are crude, childish, defiant. They are a record that resists erasure. When the world insists on moving forward, those marks feel like anchors. Their presence demands that we choose remembrance over indifference, and action over silence. Remember and let memory become the first step toward change. The Sullivan story persists because someone refused to let the floor swallow the truth. If you are moved by this tale, let it be the seed of something practical: support for child welfare, attention to local institutions, and a commitment to ask uncomfortable questions. Horror is not only the cry in a shadowed basement, it is what happens when communities avert their eyes. To face the horror is, in the oldest sense, to be human. This account is the work of piecing together fragments, diaries, bones, ledger lines, and the quiet testimony of those who remembered. If there is a final image to hold, let it be the small, stubborn light that refuses to be put out. The act of telling, the act of listening, the act of doing something afterward. The Sullivan house will stand until someone tears it down. The memory of the 47 should stand forever.